The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello to everyone online. We are just going to wait a couple more seconds to let folks join the webinar before we get started. Okay, it's 12:01, so we will get started. So hi to everyone. On behalf of the Northwest Territories Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for the second in a series of webinars to celebrate National Invasive Species Action Week. Today, we are so excited to have not just one, but two talks on wildlife disease. So our first talk, focusing on rabies virus, will be by Dr. Jutha, who I will introduce first. So Dr. Jutha is the Territorial Wildlife Veterinarian and Chief Veterinary Officer for the Northwest Territories. She also serves as the chair of the Canadian Council of Chief Veterinary Officers National Rabies Working Group. Naima completed an Honours Bachelor of Science in Biological Sciences at the University of Guelph and her Doctor of Veterinary Medicine at the Ontario Veterinary College. Naima is currently finishing her PhD thesis studying community-based approaches to wildlife health surveillance as it applies to mountain caribou. For fun, she loves to play music on guitar and drums when no one's listening, and exploring wild spaces with her awesome dog, Dak. Our second, I'll just let you know, Naima, your presentation, it went out of presenter mode. There you go. Okay. And to introduce, our second talk will be focused on avian influenza and will be presented by Jennifer Provencher and Eric Reed. Jennifer Provencher is a wildlife health research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada, Science and Technology Branch in Ottawa, Ontario. Jennifer's research focuses on wildlife health, including contaminants, plastic pollution, parasites, and pathogens. She is focused on contaminants and parasites in migratory birds in Nunavut since 2007 and continues to work on several projects that assess how cumulative effects impact bird populations. Eric Reed is a population management biologist with Environment and Climate Change Canada, Canadian Wildlife Service in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. Eric's work involves monitoring and research on waterfowl in the NWT and Nunavut, as well as the management of migratory game birds. A key focus of Eric's research has been on demography and migratory connectivity of waterfowl and waterbirds in boreal and Arctic environments. So thank you to Naima, to Eric, and to Jennifer for joining us today. I'm going to pass things over to Naima now to start us off with our first presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Johanna, for the introduction. And I'm very happy to be here and excited to be talking to you about something that's of great interest to me, which is rabies virus and its role in wildlife and human, environmental, and domestic animal health in the north. So as Johanna mentioned, I'm the wildlife vet here in based out of Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, and this is, I'm gonna give this presentation on rabies, and you can see there is this most adorable picture of this Arctic fox here. What I found during my time as a vet is that rabies seems to affect only the most adorable animals, which is sad, but also very interesting. Okay, so in terms of what we're talking about today, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the disease, talk about what we do to test for rabies in wildlife and in domestic species. I'm going to talk about what we're seeing here in the north right now and what this means for the future and what options we have for management. At any point, if there's any trouble with hearing me or getting the presentation on your screens or anything like that, I think you can contact Johanna through the chat, or Johanna, if you want to just yell at me and let me know to take a pause.
Will do.
Thanks. Okay, so I'll start this off with the general kind of background information on rabies. So rabies is a invariably fatal illness that's caused by a viral organism. This virus is part of the LISA virus group that falls under a family of viruses called rabidoviruses. So these are what are called RNA viruses. So that's just a specific group of viruses that speaks to how they replicate in their host's body. This is so rabies is known as a neurotrophic virus. That's just a fancy word for saying that it really likes to hang out in the nervous system. So in tissues that are associated with your central nervous system, like your brain or your spinal cord, or even in the nerves that go out all the way to your fingertips and your toes that help us to sense pain or touch or allow us to move our muscles around and do everything that we need to do in day-to-day activities. What happens is the virus actually invades that nervous tissue, and the reason it really likes the nervous system is because that's a place it can hang out and stay safe from the body's immune response. So this is something that the virus has adapted to evade any kind of destruction by the body's immune system in the animal or the person that it's infecting. It's a very ancient disease. Reports of rabies date back to domestic dog cases from over 4,000 years ago. There are stories that have passed down through different artifacts and documents that speak about a rabies-like virus from a very long time ago. One interesting fact is rabies is actually listed by the World Health Organization, the WHO, as one of the neglected tropical diseases. So they find that, at least globally, rabies tends to predominantly affect poor and vulnerable populations who live in more remote rural locations. Approximately 80% of human cases actually occur in rural areas. So where does rabies occur? Pretty much everywhere. So on every continent except for Antarctica, actually, you can find rabies. And so it occurs in more than 150 different countries. The World Health Organization actually estimated that about 60,000 human deaths occur from rabies each year. Now, keep in mind that this is with 95% of human cases are actually occurring in Africa and Asia. And over 99% of human cases are actually occur from exposure to an infected domestic dog. Rabies globally actually costs about $8.6 billion US in terms of its economic impacts, and this has a lot to do with this figure right here. More than almost 30 million people actually have to get post-exposure rabies vaccines every year, and so that ends up being quite costly on healthcare systems. One interesting figure that I found is that about 40% of people that are bitten by animals that are suspected to have rabies actually are children under 15 years old. And this speaks to the importance of really encouraging behaviors to prevent bites from infected or animals with unknown infection status with rabies. Okay, so who can get rabies? All mammals are potentially susceptible to rabies. Specifically, carnivores tend to be the higher risk animals that tend to get rabies. When I say high risk here, and you can see this list of species that I've mentioned in terms of high risk species that we see here in North America, what this is referring to is animals that actually hold these specific characteristics that make them good candidates for the rabies virus to maintain in that given region over the long term. So this means animals that can support the length of typical incubation period, so the amount of time that the virus stays infected within the system, the duration and the amount of virus that actually gets excreted by that animal when it's trying to spread to the next host, the amount of time that that animal actually has clinical signs. All of these factors correlate with that host, so that individual species, whether it's a bat or a fox or a skunk, it has to correlate with their population dynamics, how they behave, how they socially use space, and other such factors. The virus's main goal is that it wants to be transmitted to infective hosts enough, but not so much that it actually kills too many victims to really survive and be maintained in a population. So when you have an ideal species that can really support that virus's goal of really being maintained long-term in one area to be what's called endemic, then that's when you get a high-risk species or a good host for rabies. And those hosts end up often having their own strains of rabies. So we have bat strains of rabies, we have an Arctic fox strain of rabies, we have skunk rabies, raccoon rabies. Of course, people can also get rabies. Rabies is a zoonotic disease, and zoonotic means that it can be transmitted between humans and non-human animals. And this, of course, makes it a real concern in areas where we see rabies virus that circulates. Not only, does this bring concern to the health of wildlife and domestic animal populations, but of course, we have that human health factor in there too, which makes this really a one health disease. Okay, so how does rabies spread? So the infective substance for rabies from an infected animal is actually their saliva, and I'm going to explain why that is in just a second here. But in terms of how rabies can be spread from host to host, animal to animal, or animal to human, it's from a bite of an infected animal, typically. That would be the most common way to spread rabies. It is also possible for this to occur by salivary contamination of like an open wound. So you have like an open cut on you and an infected animal licks that, or there's saliva that contaminates it, and also mucous membranes, so our eyes or our gums, for example. In terms of how long rabies incubates, so how long it takes for the virus to infect someone, for it to be able to be spread or spill over to other hosts, and of course, the end point, unfortunately, with rabies, which is 100% fatal once you've been successfully infected and have clinical signs, that period can actually be really variable. It can be from a couple of weeks. It can even be from a few days sometimes in severe cases, depending on where the bite occurs, and it can be up to months. 6-7 months even have been reported. So this is how specifically rabies actually works, how it gets transmitted. So in this picture, we have an example of a raccoon that, say, has a rabies infection. So when it's infected by rabies, it's showing those typical signs of having excessive salivation, and it might show some signs of aggression, which would predispose it to biting another animal for rabies to try and pass on to the next host. So in this case, the raccoon bites this dog, and the virus ends up going into the muscle of the dog and searching for a neuron, so part of the nervous system. It's looking for a nerve, because that nerve is going to be its highway to get to the spinal cord or the brain. So once rabies finds the nerve, it really likes to hang out there. Remember, it wants to escape any of the effects of the immune system that's trying to kill anything foreign that's entered the body. So it gets to the nerve, it travels up that nerve into the spinal cord or the central nervous system, so spinal cord and the brain. And once it gets there, it really likes that tissue, so it starts to replicate quite rapidly. And once it actually gets to the brain stem and other parts of the brain, rabies also likes to go to the salivary glands. This is the interesting part. When it replicates in the salivary glands, this is why you have animals that are drooling excessively, and why that saliva ends up being the method of that rabies being able to spread to the next host. And then it starts the cycle over again, where that saliva can now contaminate the next animal, and then the next animal. So this is just an image that shows the same kind of idea if there's a bite in a person. And so once again, a bite in a muscle, it travels up a nerve all the way to the brain, and then starts causing the symptoms of having, those central neurological symptoms like seeming depressed or agitated, aggressive, maybe having seizures or spasms. And typically, once you have symptoms, rabies can cause death quite quickly. And usually death is between 9 and 14 days from infection. In terms of this diagram, it also shows that the farther away the bite is from the brain, the longer it takes for that virus to really take hold in the brain and to cause symptoms and lead to death. So if you get bitten in your pinky toe, then it's going to take a little bit longer for rabies symptoms to show up than if you got bitten in the neck. So in terms of the clinical signs in animals, and this would apply to people, so in all mammals, one of the most common signs would just be general sickness and fever. But people also report seeing problems swallowing, and this is a common one that I've heard, or excessive drooling or saliva dripping from the mouth. And that has to do with, remember, the virus hanging out in those salivary glands and replicating there. So it's really to the virus's advantage to produce more saliva, because that means you're more likely to be able to spread and the virus can continue to survive. Aggression, that's the typical one that people think of when they think of in the movies. You see Cujo, or you've seen Old Yeller, where you have that really aggressive dog. Really what I try and think of is that it's a very, what a sign of rabies would be a very abnormal behavior for that particular animal. So aggression can happen, but also sedation, like acting sedated or acting really subdued or tame, can also happen. Fearlessness is a common symptom that I've heard of with rabies. Sorry, did my presentation just stop presenting in the right mode there, Johanna?
Yes.
Okay, how's that?
It's back.
Okay, that was weird.
Okay.
Fly biting, so that's where an animal's just snapping at nothing in the air. That's another common neurological syndrome that we see with rabies. Paralysis, so unable to move. And then I wrote here down bat, a really common one in the south where they have had positive cases in bats is people will find a bat that is not really willing to move. It seems really lethargic and it's just lying there. And so my take-home message in those cases is, if you find a bat, you should not touch it. You should call your local wildlife officer, because bats can carry rabies, and often the symptoms are just them looking very adorable and lying there all sleepy on the floor. And so you'd be tempted to try and pick it up and take care of it, but that's not a good idea. So when we do have to test for rabies, an unfortunate truth when it comes to doing health monitoring for rabies is that we still have no approved live animal test for rabies. The way to sample an animal for rabies is that we actually have to take the head with the full brain and brain stem to send it to the lab. And we send it to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's rabies lab, either in Lethbridge, Alberta, or in Ottawa, Ontario. And they're able to do something called a fluorescent antibody test. So this is the gold standard that's recommended by the World Health Organization. And they look at the brain tissue and the tissues of the brain stem for signs of rabies. Other methods that can be done on whether it be older samples or samples that are not the entire brain are they can do what's called a PCR. A lot of people have heard of this in the age of the pandemic. So this is looking for the virus, the genetics of the virus. And we can also look at the tissues under the microscope to find what are called Negri bodies, which are little viral inclusion bodies. You can see here the little dark stippling and the pink figures that are located in those cells there. And so generally speaking, it's not a pleasant approach of having to sample, but it is very necessary that we rule out, especially in the case of animals that have potentially bitten a person or bitten a domestic animal and might have spread rabies. We need to confirm that rabies is not in fact there, because like I've mentioned previously, rabies is fatal 100% of the time once it's able to take hold and cause an infection. Okay, so in terms of the north, so what we see in the Northwest Territories and across the Arctic, along the range of the Arctic fox actually, is what's called Arctic fox rabies. So this is a strain of rabies that has found that the Arctic fox seems to provide the best circumstance for this virus to survive and to remain what's called endemic, so really be maintained within the population over a long term. It also does often spill over into red foxes, and we're starting to see more positive cases show up in red foxes in addition to Arctic foxes. And this might have to do with the changing ranges of the red foxes to be communicating more with the Arctic fox range. We do occasionally see outbreaks that occur periodically, where we have an increased number of cases of Arctic fox rabies, and because of those increased cases, they can spill over into other hosts. So whether it's other carnivores like wolverines or wolves or bears, or if it's domestic dogs. We do have a problem where we have increased chances of exposure of domestic dogs to Arctic foxes in our remote Arctic communities where these foxes tend to occur, especially along that Arctic Ocean coastline. Dogs tend to be housed outside. Unfortunately, due to lack of access to regular veterinary care, we do have animals that are largely unvaccinated, so these populations don't really have that established immunity that we might see in some of the more southern regions. And what we've actually been seeing lately is that since late 2020, we've been seeing a rabies epizootic or a rabies epidemic event. What that means is that we're in the midst of an outbreak where we're seeing an increased amount of cases that are showing up not only in foxes, but also in dogs. Oftentimes, we're not necessarily able to send off animals for testing to confirm, and we rely largely on symptoms. But we have seen an uptick in actually confirmed cases that we have been able to send down south, with a total of 12 cases so far during this outbreak that have been confirmed, and a number of others that were confirmed by visual observation and symptoms that were consistent with rabies. So right here, this is a map, and this map is still in draft. This was developed by the Public Health Agency of Canada, and they are actually starting to post, or they're hoping to start posting more regularly updated maps every year on rabies incidences throughout Canada to track these and how they're changing over time. What you can see in the north here, that pink region, that's the Arctic fox range. And you can kind of see that that would be the area we would attribute to a high risk area for rabies from the Arctic fox strain. The little red dots that are sitting within there are cases that have been confirmed in 2022 of rabies. So the case in Yellowknife there, I will qualify that. That was a case that was actually imported to Yellowknife. It's not one that occurred, an exposure that occurred in Yellowknife. Just the confirmatory sampling that was sent off for testing, that was done through the Yellowknife lab. So what can we do? We have this scary disease. It's occurring in wild animals. It's occurring in domestic dogs more globally, with canine variant of virus actually luckily not being a problem here in North America at this time, not being established. So what kinds of things can we do to manage rabies and to protect people, protect wildlife, protect domestic pets? So my advice is absolutely vaccination. Rabies vaccine is pretty awesome in that it's very, very, very effective. I got my rabies vaccine about 13 years ago. I get a titer check done where I get my blood drawn to check if I have a protective vaccine every couple of years to make sure that it continues to be protective. And I actually personally have been exposed to rabies and tested my titer immediately after, before getting post-exposure vaccines, and my vaccine was reactive and it did protect me and save my life. So I am definitely pro-rabies vaccine. We do have great vaccines for pets, dogs, cats, ferrets, and other animals. And I do advise that people get their pets vaccinated at the advice of their veterinarian every 1 to 3 years, depending on the vaccine that they're giving. In terms of people that work in high-risk jobs like myself, or people who are handling carnivores often, there are vaccines available, and you can talk to your healthcare provider. If you've been exposed to an animal that may have had rabies, or in a high-risk area, you've been exposed to an animal with unknown rabies vaccine status by a bite, then you need to report that to your local healthcare professional. There are post-exposure vaccines that can be available if they deem them appropriate. And then vaccinations in wildlife has been tried out in different jurisdictions where they've put out vaccine baits, actually, so dropped food baits. And you can see this adorable little raccoon in the bottom right corner there eating a vaccine bait. And this can provide immune protection in wild animals as well. And in different areas, this may or may not be deemed appropriate depending on the behaviors of the animals that are affected and how wide their range is. But definitely a cool option for management of rabies in wildlife. Another big thing is actually controlling the importation of high-risk species from high-risk areas. An interesting thing that we saw just this past year, actually, in one of our southern provinces, so in Ontario, was a couple of dogs that were imported from the Middle East and actually had canine variant of rabies. We are canine rabies free in terms of the dog variant of rabies. We have, of course, wildlife rabies that can spill over into dogs, but we don't have that specific dog only rabies. But we imported it here by accident through adoptions that happened with rescue dogs from the Middle East. And that actually was quite a hairy experience in Ontario, where they had to follow up with multiple people that had been exposed. And so importing animals that are coming from endemic areas, so high-risk areas, to lower-risk areas can really help facilitate the spread of rabies, and we don't want to do that. Increasing awareness of how to practice good bite prevention, so how to handle dogs, how not to go and interact with dogs that you don't know, helping with controlling feral domestic populations, so stray dogs, too many stray dogs in a community that can help to potentiate the spread of rabies. And then I already mentioned the oral vaccines in wildlife. And the other piece is doing what we can to limit contact between wildlife and our pets. Pets should not be interacting with wild animals in general, and rabies is one of many examples as to why that's so necessary. So whether it's maintaining good fencing or making sure that your animal is kept inside during high-risk rabies seasons, or during outbreaks, that's really important. And also reporting sick, diseased, dead wildlife. As soon as you notice if an animal is acting strangely, if they seem ill, if they're dead, you do not touch them. You call your local ENR office and an officer will respond. If you're noticing changes in the health of wildlife in your community, then absolutely you can contact me, and I'll put my contact on the next slide here for you. So these are all various options of what we can do to help mitigate the risks associated with rabies, and also help to manage rabies as it occurs in our pets, as it might occur in human exposures, and of course in wildlife. And just a final slide here, we also run a lay vaccinator program through the government of the Northwest Territories. This is in partnership between ENR and public health. And what we have done is actually provided on-the-ground training to vaccinators in multiple remote communities. Because of the lack of access to vaccines and veterinary care, we're working to encourage that capacity in smaller communities so that I can provide those vaccines, and individuals interested in the community can have training on the handling of dogs and administering those vaccines, so that we can increase the amount of dogs in communities that are protected from rabies. Because like I said in one of those first slides, over 99% of cases in people tend to be from exposure through a dog. And the dogs are going to be kind of that connection between wildlife and humans, and of course for the safety and the well-being of the dogs themselves. So if you live in a remote community that doesn't have regular access to vet care, so outside of Yellowknife or some of the communities in the South Slave region and in Nuvik, if you live in a remote community and you want to know if you have a lay vaccinator there, or if you're interested in becoming a lay vaccinator and receiving training, please do get in touch with me, and we can work on getting that done. But that's all I have for you guys today. I know that was a lot of information. Please do feel free to pelt me with questions, and I'll hand this over to Johanna.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Naima. That was an excellent presentation. I will let folks know if you have questions for Naima, you can feel free to pop them in the chat. We will save them till the very end of the webinar during the Q&A session, but I will hand things over to Eric Reed and Jennifer Provencher so that they can get started on their presentation. Thanks again, Naima. And yeah, if folks have questions, just hang tight and we will get to the Q&A session after Jennifer and Eric's presentation is over. So I see that you're all set up. Eric and Jennifer, you are free to go ahead. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks so much for the introduction. So my name is Jennifer Provencher, and I'm with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And we are working on avian influenza in a couple of different ways. And I'll just pause and I'll let Eric introduce himself as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here and was really interested in the previous presentation on rabies. So I'm Eric Reed. I'm a population management biologist at Canadian Wildlife Service based out of Yellowknife. Basically, my my work focuses on waterfowl, ducks, geese, and swans in Nunavut and Northwest Territories. And so we decided to split this presentation in between both of us. Jennifer's our wildlife health expert, and she can speak more to the actual virus and explain a little bit more about that, and I'll jump in a little bit later and talk about more specifically the situation in the Northwest Territories.
Awesome, thanks so much. So Eric's going to drive the slideshow. So we'll tag team here a little bit. So we'll go to the next slide. So yeah, just for context, we do study wildlife health in a couple of different ways. We study several different avian viruses and diseases in our group. And so currently there is, as probably many of you know, there is an avian influenza outbreak in globally as well as North America. And if you go online, there's you know, a number of different kind of infographics and sites that explain what avian influenza or bird flu is. I've just kind of grabbed a few of them and put them here. There is quite a bit of information. Kind of generally, it does focus mostly around poultry or domestic birds because it is quite common to have severe outcomes in those birds. But avian influenza, it is a virus. It commonly circulates around wild birds. Typically, in most wild bird species, there are very few symptoms. And so in the past, ECCC, along with partners in the provinces and territories, have monitored for avian influenza. It is something we do fairly regularly. And for the most part, we detect it, but again, it's in predominantly, you know, otherwise healthy birds. There are some forms of avian influenza that can transfer to humans, which is why there is quite a bit of kind of infographics and information around avian influenza and how to prevent the spread to humans. But this one in particular seems to have a lower kind of affinity for humans. And so we're primarily thinking about this currently as kind of a bird problem. Although all the good lessons we've learned through COVID about, you know, hygiene and hand washing and again, you know, bringing lessons over from Naima's presentation in terms of wildlife and handling wildlife are still good to adhere to. So we'll go to the next slide, Eric. So there are different types of avian influenza, and in general, we talk about the low pathogenic and the high pathogenic strains. Previously in North America, we've had, you know, many different forms of the low pathogenic circulation. This is what we regularly do surveillance for in North America. This is what kind of, again, is common in wild birds. They're very, you know, there's no disease in wild birds, but there can be some mild disease in domestic birds. The version that we're kind of talking about right now, though, is a highly pathogenic form, and this is where you actually have some mortality in wild birds, and then, of course, fairly large mortality or fairly large outbreaks in those domestic bird populations. And so it's those highly pathogenic forms that kind of make the news most often, and it's an H5N1 that is currently circulating in different parts of the globe, but again, primarily in North America is where we've been tracking it right now. So next. So again, this has been going on in this kind of particular H5N1 for avian influenza has been going on for a few years now. So this is what the global picture looked like. This is from the the FAO site. And so, you know, there's global tracking of avian influenza and has been for many years. This is what the situation looked like kind of last summer, kind of pre-fall of 2021. And there were large outbreaks in the UK. And this map basically shows what the situation looked from October 2020 to September 2021. And you can see it's very much confined to Asia, Europe, and Africa. And so what, you know, you'll notice that all of the Americas are kind of H5N1 free at this time. And so this particular strain has kind of been circulating. But then next slide, kind of what changed is we had a detection in Newfoundland actually in late 2021. And so when that it was, you know, we had from Environment Canada, we had teams out in December sampling, we had teams out on Christmas Eve sampling some of the birds. And since then, we've seen these detections move westwards through the continent, and now we're starting to see them move north as well. And so this map kind of shows all of the detections from October all the way through till the end of April. Then, of course, we've had more detections move on since then. So you'll notice that detection in Iceland, there's that new red dot in Iceland, and we see the detections move across at least North America. And so this continues to be tracked on a regular basis. So next slide. So the 2022 strain is different from some of the previous ones. If you've been involved in any of the previous avian influenza work in North America, this is a wordy slide, but there is significant host expansions. There's kind of more species being affected. There's significant range expansion. So again, that map, it's wider than we've seen in previous events, even of this particular form of high-path avian influenza. And one of the things that has really alerted, again, the detection of this is because we actually see high levels of wild bird mortality. And this has now been observed both in North America and Europe, where there are kind of huge sections huge groups of birds dying, and not often, but there have been a few cases where the die-off is of a particular species with a small population has been a significant, so potentially leading to population level effects. And the biggest example of this is barnacle geese in Europe, where it's been estimated that about 20% of the barnacle geese in that population have actually succumbed to avian influenza. And then one of the big things that the virologists are still working on, but we're seeing is it's suspected higher prevalence in some populations. But the big piece there is the evidence of maintenance, and that really means that it's over kind of going through the seasons with the birds. So in past events, avian influenza could have had this peak, and then it kind of petered out naturally, and so you had these waves of avian influenza. And what we're seeing in Europe right now, which may or may not play out in North America, is that we're actually seeing avian influenza in those European birds kind of persist through those seasonal cycles. Next slide. And so we've done previous surveillance. I've just kind of tallied the numbers up a little bit here from some of the previous data. We do both live bird surveillance, so again, healthy looking birds as well as those sick and dead birds. And so we do most of the work, you know, throughout the PTs. I will note that the Northwest Territories has, in this time period of 2007 to 2019, has had very few submissions. And it looks like mostly it's submissions of those sick and dead birds. So very similar to what Naima was just talking about. If there is a sick or dead bird, it gets reported, and that can be, you know, depending on the species and the location, it can go for testing. But then we see very little live bird sampling in the Northwest Territories to date. Next one. And so just a little bit about a neighbor. So we have done more surveillance in Nunavut, and this just gives you an idea of some of the patterns. And a lot of the live birds in Nunavut are actually tested through some of the Environment Canada banding programs, which is why there's much higher numbers. So we do see lots of interannual variation. There are years where we have no avian influenza detected whatsoever. We've never had high paths reported in the territory to date, and I believe that's still true. But again, as of our current information about birds across the territories, there are some susceptible species, including ducks and geese. There's others, but it is very patchy in the environment. And so while we have some species that are affected in some regions and not others, it's pretty difficult to predict, and it does have to do with kind of their migration routes, their densities on the colonies, and their contact with other species. Next slide. And so where a lot of this information is going is a website. And so this is a dashboard that is maintained by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. This is where we put up all of the kind of most recent detections in Canada. And so it'll tell you species, it'll tell you a whole bunch of different information, lab confirmation, all kinds of things. But this is the kind of best way to get the most up-to-date information. And again, it tells you about wild birds as well as domestic birds. And so it has lots of information and is openly available. And so for those of you who are interested, I encourage you to check this out. Next slide. And so the other place you can look, and again, there's a little bit of a lag, is the USGS actually plots the North American data. This is, thank you, Eric, for updating this. This was just updated yesterday. They do it every couple of days. And so you can see the green dots are those positive detections. And so you can see they're sprinkled throughout the kind of lower 48. There's detections now in almost all of there are detections in all of the provinces, but I will also draw your attention, there is a positive wild bird in Anchorage, Alaska. You can see that green dot. And then not included on this map, but is publicly available on Facebook, is there is also a positive wild bird in Nunavut. And so we do see this kind of northern movement of birds, and with that we are starting to get some detections there. The birds are not nearly as dense in the northern range, and of course they're just arriving, but we are starting to see some reports come back as positive. Next slide. Eric, do you want me to keep going, or is this where you wanted to start talking?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in here, Jen, and I'll just maybe take a couple step backs and talk about the sampling that's happened in the Northwest Territories in the past. You showed on that graph pretty clearly that there's been not a lot. It's been very spotty in the past. Part of the reason is that we've not had long-term banding programs operating where it was easy to collect samples. But we're in the process of starting to establish some more regular monitoring in the Northwest Territories. So hopefully in years to come we'll show a little bit better on that graph. But all that to say that Jen's showed the maps of the distribution and the evolution of the the virus across Europe and then North America. And as she mentioned, wild birds are the key vector for that virus. They're the key carriers, and they are the ones who really contribute to the spread of the virus. And so here, what you've got is a schematic, figure of how birds mix in North America. So those are migratory birds. The different colors refer to what we call flyways. So they're major north-south corridors that birds populations use. And as you can see, if you start from the south, those flyways are pretty discrete. There is some overlap, but for the most part, relatively discrete. And then into southern Canada, still a certain amount of independence between them. But then when you get to the north, we're really getting birds from all over North America breeding during the breeding season in the territories. So if you, it's a little bit hard to make Great Slave Lake under all those dots, but you know, if you think about Yellowknife, you've got birds from everywhere, basically. Birds that will winter on the Atlantic coast, birds that winter on the Pacific coast, and everywhere in between. So there's a huge hodgepodge of birds here, and so that's going to influence what we're kind of expecting in terms of the avian influenza virus making its way into the territories. So we've been collaborating with a team of researchers from the United States Geological Survey for a few years now. Those people are based in California, in the Central Valley, and they've been deploying GPS collars on a number of species of geese and ducks. And so we started collaborating with them. We deployed such collars for a couple of years before COVID on Banks Island. There's also people deploying, you know, those transmitters in Alaska and even in Russia, on Wrangel Island in Russia. So what they've done is they've analyzed all of the movement data for the 3 years of information that we have for 6 species of ducks and geese using the Pacific Flyway. And they put all that together to model the movement day to day of migratory birds from the wintering grounds in Mexico and the United States and into Canada. So this is an animation. This is where you know, we're taking a little bit of risk with this. Whoops, sorry, with this presentation, because sometimes this crashes. Hopefully not. Before I start the animation, I'll just point out a few things. So the blue dots are birds, and so you'll see the date in the corner, upper left corner change as you know, time goes by, and you'll see those blue dots move around. So those are the birds, the bird movements, and then at some point we'll see some red dots. Those are known outbreak areas. So that map that Jen was showing with the known cases, the known outbreak areas, you're going to see those start to appear, and then overlaid with the movement of the birds, and then some orange dots will start appearing, and they're the predicted exposure areas. So once we know that birds have been in an outbreak area, where do we expect the next outbreak potentially to happen? Where do we expect exposed birds to go? So I'll just run that if I can find this. Yeah, there you go. So it gives us a tool to better predict how, well, first to better understand how birds can act and can lead to, you know, the dissemination of the virus. So this is the summer, we're in July. Birds are not moving too much. They're raising their young, slowly coming back August, September, and now they're going back to the US and down into Mexico. If we let this run, you'll notice, and you may have noticed already, that maybe I need to start it again. Let's see. But you'll see that right now there is no AI in California and in the Southwest US, and so this is useful in trying to you know, trying to determine when the virus might appear in some areas. Same thing with the territories. We don't have any confirmed cases yet, and so when we look at that, we can see what is likely to happen. So anyways, this was, I thought, a fairly interesting application of some of the research and monitoring that we do, and maybe give people a better feel for what might come in the coming weeks and months. So we've got great information for a number of species, like we just saw in that animation, but bird migration is complex and messy, and there's a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of movements between areas of a country or a continent, and even across major barriers like the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean. And so when we factor the global flyways, it becomes really, really hard to predict where things are going to show up. So, I mean, the animation kind of showed that we could expect the virus to make its way over to northeast Russia, to Asia, That's going to be interesting to see if it happens. And then maybe there's overlap with populations that might migrate more towards the Euro-Asian highways. So lots of overlap, lots of mixing. One thing that we're pretty confident about is that the virus will come to the north, to the territories, to Canada's north, but we still don't know what's going to be the extent and the and the impacts of that. So yeah, I think it's hard to predict movements. It's hard to predict where it's going to show up. One interesting thing that I noticed from the map, from one of the maps with the known outbreaks before, is we've been, and something we've been seeing throughout this is we've been seeing sometimes in some areas the virus show up in commercial poultry operations before we detect it in wild birds. In some other cases it was different. It was the other way around. But like right now, we've noticed it in Oregon, for instance, in poultry operations. So there is some obviously undetected movement of the virus, and the birds are carrying it. And so until we get more samples from birds and more, we can't always be a step ahead and predict, know that it's coming. We've seen northwestern movement in AIV, and we can just predict that it's probably gonna spread all over North America within the next few months. And then with the breeding birds dispersing to northern breeding grounds, that's what we're expecting to see relatively soon, is seeing some cases start to show up in the territories, just as we've seen down in the prairies and down in the US in the winter. So we're encouraging community members, we're encouraging anybody who likes to go out and observe ducks, or who's out on the land, to report any sightings of dead or sick birds. That's critical in our understanding of the distribution of the disease, but also the impact of the disease. So what species are being impacted, how many, and all those things. Some of the signs that a bird is sick, I think there was some signs on the very first slide, but you would see a lack of coordination, maybe a swelling around the eyes and the neck and the head area. Birds tend to be very lethargic, so they tend to not move a lot. They may not flush if you're walking towards them, coughing, gasping for air, and things like that. We're telling people not to touch those sick or dead birds, but to call their local conservation officers, or the NWT wildlife vet. So NISAW was, I'm sorry, I don't have it in this presentation, but NISAW had it on her very last slide in her presentation. So if you do see some suspected AIV cases out there, do report it to the authorities. And if you do come in contact with birds that have it, just practice good hygiene, as we've all learned through these COVID years to do. In terms of strategies for going forward, we're doing, this is an ongoing thing, and to submit any dead or sick birds to labs for determining the causes of death. So we're doing that right now. Live bird surveillance in the Northwest Territories. The plan is to do some sampling on horned grebes in the coming month. So those would be locally breeding grebes around Yellowknife. And then we also plan to take samples on snow geese on Banks Island later in the summer. We started doing some sampling on hunter harvested birds last year. This is likely to continue this fall. And so those are the plans right now for the territories. We don't have any specific plans for environmental sampling here, but I think in Nunavut they will go ahead with some of that. So I think I'll stop it there, and then if anybody has questions, they can ask them if there's anything that you would like to.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Eric and Jen. That was really great. I will now welcome anyone who has a question to put it into the chat box. Either if your question is for NEMA or for Eric or Jen, we'll be taking all questions now. So go ahead and put them in the chat box. I have a question in here already that is for Eric or Jen. The question, it asks, since we don't have any avian influenza in the NWT currently, would you presume the likelihood of the virus occurring in the NWT this summer is 100%? That's the question.
Maybe I'll start. I'll start, and maybe Jen can jump in afterwards. We can't say we don't have it in the territories yet. We haven't detected it.
Right.
Okay. So there's likely birds that are carrying it that have made their way up into the territory, but we've not detected it. So I am not aware of any mass mortalities having occurred since the start of migration. But also note that it's only been a few days since the weather's been nice enough for birds to start moving through. So the first geese, I mean, some of them may have been here a little bit earlier, but the main passage of geese was over the weekend. And we're just starting to see those birds come up. So we might very well see some cases show up. In terms of what we can expect, maybe I'll ask Jen to provide an answer for that.
Yeah, I would concur with Eric. We haven't detected any yet, and I would say that our surveillance on live birds in Nunavut has showed us that we don't necessarily need to have die-offs to have avian influenza present. And specifically in ducks and geese, they can look just fine and still have it. So so it's hard to predict. You know, if I had to make a generalization, you know, based on data from Alaska, based on, you know, data that we're seeing other places, I would say that you know, the chances of some birds in NWT having it are as high, but they're still going to be low numbers, right? We're still talking about prevalences in the population that are single digit. So we're not talking about kind of big numbers of birds having it. They're just, you know, 1, 2, 3% of the birds might have it. And so it's tricky whether, you know, whether or not there's going to be die-offs. Yeah. I would feel more comfortable answering that question in like a week or two, especially what Eric just told me based on migration routes. So it's going to be this connection between the migration of those birds and then also those other birds coming in. And so there's a few different pieces to that puzzle, but I think NWT could have detections, and likely there are birds who have it already, but whether we've been able to detect it is a different question.
Okay, thank you. We have another question for Eric and Jen. It says, there have been some cases of spotted livers in geese in the ISR. Is this a symptom?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd have to go back to my pathology sheets. I don't believe so in and upon itself. If that was the only thing that was wrong with them, I don't think that that's a real clear signal. That probably has to do with something else. The signs and symptoms for most is respiratory and neurological. Most of the birds also sometimes have other things like because they're acting weird, so they can get hit by cars. They're kind of easy prey for other animals. So liver spots alone, I would not say is a direct point to avian influenza, although they could occur with other symptoms, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question here. Do we have an idea of a survivability percentage for infected birds?
Great question.
Don't think we have that yet, do we?
So we don't have it, but we can tell you that there are some species who get it, more passerines, smaller birds, and they seem to, I'm going to rephrase it. We find very few kind of small passerine birds alive and have it. So if they have it, we're more likely to find them dead. But things like ducks and geese, we find them dead and we find them alive and carriers. And so there are different birds who kind of have different kind of clinical signs. And so we will be doing testing this fall or this summer, as Eric described, spring and summer. And there are several projects where we will also be taking blood from live birds and seeing if they have kind of immune metrics, so serology tests. So it's a great question. We don't particularly have an answer for that, but it's a work in progress and something we're really interested in.
Great.
Yeah, and in terms of the exact numbers, no, we don't have that yet. Like Jen said, maybe later we'll have that. In terms of species that are impacted and that are dying, then we have a better picture of that. So the dabbling ducks, the mallards and the widgeon, and those ducks seem to be less affected by it. Am I right, Jen? I mean, there has been some mortalities, I think, but not to the extent that we've seen in geese, for instance. Geese seem to be particularly affected by this strain. And so we've seen some mortalities in Canada geese and snow geese. And then there's a few other species. Scaup is another duck that's been impacted where mortalities have been noted. So it depends on the species, and yeah, it depends on the prevalence of the virus in the population as well.
Interesting. Okay, I've got a question for Naima. Naima, if you're there, do you mind turning on your camera or unmuting yourself? Naima, hey. We are at the hour, so I guess I can try to keep this short, but you mentioned in your presentation rabies being a One Health disease, and I just wondered if you could expand on that and explain a little bit about what that means.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So when I say One Health, this is an emerging concept in multiple fields right now that is looking at health more holistically as it applies to not just human health, for example, or not specifically just animal or wildlife or pet health, but and not just environmental health, but kind of looping all of these things together and recognizing that the health of all of these different groups collectively and kind of like, I guess, I'm losing words here, but basically the health of all of these different groups can impact each other and can also be good indicators for each other. We can look to animal health to better understand human health and vice versa, and that for the environment. And so One Health is the idea that we need to take multidisciplinary approaches to more holistically address these complicated questions, like how healthy is a population. Why I call rabies a One Health disease is because it's one of those really great examples of a disease that really intersects at all of those different realms. Rabies, in this case, in the north, for example, is a disease that is endemic or maintained in a wildlife population, Arctic foxes. When it starts to apply to human and domestic animal health is when we get these outbreaks and we see spillover into dogs, and potentially cats can be that kind of conduit, can be that connection to humans. And when humans get exposed, then of course that's also a major problem, because now we can have fatalities, or we need public health responses with people. So rabies, as much as it's a terrible disease, it's also one of those diseases that brings together the families of public health officials and wildlife health officials, domestic animal health, veterinary practitioners, for example, and of course members of the public, to be able to really address the issue. Environmental health also plays a big role there too, when we're starting to see spillover into different species that might be changing their ranges or their potential for exposure to rabies because of climate change and other factors that are driving changes in distributions of populations. So that's part of why I think rabies is just one of the coolest diseases, because it does allow us all to work together in that way. And actually, I think all of those things also apply to avian influenza.
Right. Thanks, Naima. I will note we are past one, but there's one more great question in the chat that I will ask. If folks have to run, that's okay. I see that Jenna's had to sign off, but one more question for Eric. It says, can there be posters made or distributed for what to look for before or during the plucking process. There are community hunts happening, and most will be distributed to elders, so that's a big concern. So maybe I'll just rephrase that as, are there resources that people can find either online or distributed to tell them what to look for, what are the signs of avian flu, and whether things are safe to eat?
Absolutely, and we sent letters to over 300 organizations in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and the Yukon, all of the HTCs, HTAs, HTOs in Nunavut, the wildlife management boards, ENR, like a host of groups. So we sent a letter with a lot of information in there, links to information, to online information. There's a lot of links. There's a lot of guidance online. So I would direct people to the Government of Canada website on avian influenza. So if you go on Google and you type avian influenza Canada, you're probably gonna see that site as one of the first hits. And there's also the Public Health Agency of Canada that has guidance for hunters and for people consuming wild birds, how to cook properly your meat. And so that guidance is all available on the web. Again, if you get to that canada.ca website, I can send a link. I don't know if you can distribute that afterwards.
Yep.
But I can send a link. There's all the information is there to how to properly handle birds and how to properly cook birds. The short of it is that healthy birds are still good to eat as long as you cook them properly. So the virus gets destroyed by heat. So if you cook it properly, there's no problem eating a healthy bird. But we'll send the links, and then people can check the more specific guidance on their own.
Perfect. Yeah, if you can send me a link, I can post that to the NWTKISP Facebook page and website and distribute it to the folks who attended this webinar.
And Johanna, just as Eric was listing off those different things, I was trying to throw each of those links in the chat. So
perfect.
Okay, great. And your conservation officer, your local conservation officer, is probably your best point of contact. And then if they have any questions they can't answer, they'll reach out to NISAW or myself, and we'll be able to take it from there.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Big thanks to NISAW, Jennifer, who had to sign off, and also Eric for those excellent presentations. And thank you to everyone online who joined us today. It was really great to have such good attendance and great questions. If you would like to join us for more great webinars this week, you can find more information at our website. That's nwtkisp.ca. I'll spell that out. It's nwtcispp.ca. Or on our Facebook page for the NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens. I think that's all the time we have today, but thank you again to all our presenters for such great presentations, and thank you to everyone online for joining.
Thank you.
Sign off now, but thanks everyone. Take care.
Have a good day.